everybody. This is your podcast host, Chris Baker, and you're listening or watching the podcast, Tell Me Your Story. Thank you again for coming on and watching. Today's special guest to tell his story is John Marino. Not Dan Marino, John Marino.
No relation, by the way, even though people used to think we were related. I'd fool a few people and tell them, yeah, but eventually I had to give it up and say no.
It's my brother.
Yeah, that's a bad. And there was somebody a long time ago who was convinced through other people that we were brothers, but I had to tell the guy, I know it's a nice joke, and I wish I was, but we're not.
John is a radio host / reporter you said too?
Yeah, host, reporter, disc jockey, public address announcer, you name it, a little acting work, you name it, I at least try to do it.
He's been a little bit of everything, and he's done it for 43 years now. Imagine that, 43 years.
43 years, went by fast.
Some of you guys watching this right now are not even that old.
No, even a lot of the people I work with are not that age, too. And I start to reference things from way back when, which is not really too far back not too far back from me, and they wonder what I'm talking about. Most people, I'm 66 years old. A lot of people think I'm late 40s, early 50s, and somebody not too long ago, when I told them my real age, they basically said, no, you're not. I said, let me prove it to you. I pulled out my wallet. I said, Eisenhower was president when I was born, and I showed them my date of birth and my driver's license. I said, believe me now? They looked and they said, yeah, I guess so, unless you forged that license. I said, no, I didn't do that. So that's the real deal.
Sir, my goodness. Shoot. So 40 years into it. Like we started to say, Dan Marino, since your name's John Marino. How often did you use the pickup line? Yeah, Dan Marino's my brother or my cousin.
Back then in the 80s, it happened frequently because I got into the business then, and your list of people that you come in contact with really expands at that point in this business. And Dan Marino was just hitting it big at the same time, too. So we kind of crossed paths that way. And I found out, I looked at him and I said, I don't think he's full-blooded Italian-American like me. And then my grandmother in South Florida in 1984 sent me an article from a Fort Lauderdale newspaper that indicated and showed he's half Eastern European, too. Oh, wow. I think that article said Polish. I've heard Lithuanian through the years, then back to Polish, then over to Lithuanian, whatever it is. From what I know, he's half Italian and half Eastern European of some sort.
So in a way, somewhere down that line, you guys might intersect and be blood in some way.
Yeah, all my work in the sports business as a sports broadcaster and sports reporter and anchor on the all news stations in New York City, 1010 Wins, and then for a long time on WCBS 880. We traveled in the same worlds, obviously. We never crossed paths, at least I don't think we were ever in the same venue that I know. We could have been, obviously, for a playoff game or something like that or whatever, but we never actually made contact. Or maybe Stadium, for example. I'm sure he attended some of those when I was there, but we never had the opportunity to meet.
All right. So let's start from the very beginning. Let's talk about your early life, your childhood. Where does it all
begin? My childhood, I was part of the old Italian-American community, the last vestiges of it in East Harlem in Manhattan. And this is a little known fact. When people think Italian neighborhoods in New York City, they think Little Italy and the San Gennaro Feast, and they think Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, where I went to school at Fordham University down the block there. But East Harlem was once the most populous Italian-American community in this country, bordered by 96th to the upper 120s, lower 130s, really on paper, and bounded by the East River all the way over to Fifth Avenue. So by the early and mid-1950s, when urban renewal came about in New York City, it was really started in the 40s. And then in the 50s, hit it big into the 60s. The old blocks and tenements were just raised around the neighborhood to build projects and public housing. And by the time I was born in the early 1960s, I was born in the late 50s. By the early 60s, weren't many of us left in the neighborhood. I'd say by the time I left in the mid 70s, the neighborhood had 6-7% Italian American. There is still a strip today in East Harlem. If you go along Pleasant Avenue by the FDR, the East River Drive, It's the FDR Drive professionally in my traffic business, growing up in the neighborhood. That's the East River Drive to us, or the West Side Highway we had a different name for that growing up back then too, the Henry Hudson Parkway, what they call nowadays. And that vestige of the community is still along Pleasant Avenue, where the infamous, famous Rayo's restaurant is located on the corner of 114th and First Avenue. My mother grew up with one of the Rayo's, so in growing up in the neighborhood, you get to know people. I've had the opportunity to dine there a few years back and to get in without a wait, basically. Did that a couple of times a few years back. And the food there was just like my mother made it. No question about that. No doubt about that, although she'd never give you her old Italian recipes. Not that I cook anyway. As she said to me one day, the best cooks in the world are Italian males. And I said, Ma, this Italian male loves to eat, but I'm never going to learn how to cook because I never had the patience for it too. So you got to have patience to cook. So I admire cooks and what they do. And you see they, labor over 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 hours over something.
Yeah.
And you got to think about that. That's a real job. You can't walk away from the stove. You can't walk away from the oven. You can't have anything come up. You can't go downstairs and talk to the mailman for a half an hour when you are cooking something up that's going to be, really good and a specialty. And just the danger factor, obviously, you got to just stay and labor over it. And it may be a labor of love being in this business for so many years for a cook. It's the same thing. So we still have a vestige of the Italian community along the East River Drive on Pleasant Avenue there. And that is from 114th to 120th Street in East Harlem nowadays. We have our old feast, and some people who watch this may know what I mean when I say the old Giglio Feast and Festival, where we get together, and I don't do this anymore, but it was a rite of passage in the community where the statue honoring an old Italian saint, actually, is lifted by over 100 guys, and the statue is about 6 stories high of a New York City tenement, and it's over 10,000 pounds. You get over 100 guys together from generations. Sometimes you get from grandfather, father to son, grandson, all the way down. And, that's a thing to do. That's a rite of passage in the neighborhood. The old Giglio Festival, held in East Harlem, still on Pleasant Avenue nowadays every year. It's also held in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Used to be in New Hyde Park, Long Island. Same people run it, basically. New Hyde Park doesn't exist anymore. We had it in North Jersey and Fort Lee for a long time, too, near the George Washington Bridge. Those days are done. So we have it in East Harlem and in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, the old Italian community. There's still a vestige of that there, and we have it there, too, as well. It's over 100 guys get together, 4-sided, and you get under a pole and you go about 6 guys deep on the pole and you lift that statue of over 10,000 pounds. And that's called the Giglio, Giglio, which means lilies in Italian. The history of that is in the year 432 AD, St. Paulinus returned to the southern Italian town of Nola. And he was a captive in slavery in North Africa for many years. And he was released from slavery in the year 432, was allowed to return home to Nola. And when he entered the town, the people of the town had all gathered lilies in their hands, and they feeded him with lilies, ripped the lilies off the buds, and threw them at him as he walked in the streets. That's the history of that festival that has been continued since the year 432 AD until today.
Wow.
And now I attend, I don't lift anymore. I go have a sausage sandwich, have a Zeppola or two, and Zeppola, or what people call Zeppelis. In the neighborhood, they are in Italian, it is actually a Zeppola, Zeppole. It's fried dough with a lot of powdered sugar on top. They're not good for you, but, once a year, I think it's okay to buy a bag of 6, kind of offer around because you have to. Hey, anybody want a Zeppola? And you hope they say no, but some people grab 1 or half, whatever, and then you eat the rest. Whether it's 3.5 or 5.5, whatever, it's all on you, as they say.
So, that was a lot. That was a lot to take in. So what was it like just growing up? I mean, the rich history in your hometown.
Of the neighborhood. What was it like growing up? This was the 60s and the early into the mid 70s. And crime ran rampant in the neighborhood by then. So you had to watch it as you went to school every day and traveled around. My parents are my mother passed away a few years ago, but I would tell her, and I tell my father to this day, you guys are very left wing politically, but when it came to your kids, you were right wing, and that would, I think, kind of offend them. But they had rules, and you had to abide by the rules. So I had to be off the streets by 8 o'clock at night during summertime, or during the winter when the sun set a lot earlier, I had to be up in the house. And my parents specifically explained to myself and my brother that you are not going to get into the kind of things that the people we grew up with around the neighborhood. And when they grew up in the neighborhood, the mafia held forth. There's no question about that. And, we still had some guys around, I guess, who kind of, maybe did a couple of things here and there, but the neighborhood had totally changed. So I grew up in the gangs era of the late 60s and early and mid 70s in East Harlem, amongst the people who eventually got together and formed. We got the 50th anniversary of hip hop going now, which was started in the Bronx. And that was formed by the vestiges, not even the vestiges, but some of the people connected to the people I grew up with in the neighborhood. So I grew up with gangs like the Black Spades. They were an African-American gang. The Savage Skulls, they were a Puerto Rican gang. The Seven Nomads, the Savage Nomads, the Ghetto Brothers, all Puerto Rican gangs where I had a lot of friends in them. Sometimes you had to cross over ethnically, a black kid or an Italian kid. I know of one Irish kid who lived 110th Street by the subway on Lexington Avenue 50 years ago, 1972. He was a member of the Black Spades. He was. So everybody crisscrossed. And then up in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx, where a lot of the Italians from the neighborhood had gone, up there, you had the Grateful Dead, named after the rock group, and you had the Bronx Aliens, and you had other groups too. You had the Golden Guineas, who were over on Arthur Avenue. I'm going to say, even though I shouldn't use that term, that's what they called themselves. That was a very well-known gang in New York City at that time, the Golden Guineas, Italian kids from over on Arthur Avenue, where Dion and the Belmonts grew up in the old neighborhood there across from Fordham University. And that's what I grew up in that atmosphere. Then in 1973, and the 50th anniversary of moving to the Bronx here is coming up on March 23rd, I'm going to put it this way. A couple of incidents, too many, happened involving myself and the guys I grew up with. So that's when my parents said, for sure, we have to get out of here. They had thought about doing it previously, and an aunt and uncle, and a couple of aunts and uncles too. But my grandmother, since she immigrated to this country from Italy in the year 1900, she immigrated here. She landed in Allentown, Pennsylvania for about a year. She actually came here in 1899. And she was in Weirton, Weirton, not Wheeling, but Weirton, Weirton, West Virginia, where you still have a good Italian community today in the northern part of West Virginia. And that was along the Ohio River across from Steubenville, Dean Martin's and Ray Boom Boom Mancini's hometown. My cousin out in Vegas actually went out with the famed boxer Ray Boom Boom Mancini back in early 1982, about 6 months before the incident with Duke Koh Kim, the Korean boxer, South Korean boxer, happened, unfortunately, in the ring back then in late 1982. But in Weirton, West Virginia, there was a sizable Italian immigrant community. After about a year, my grandmother moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania. My grandfather had just immigrated from southeastern Italy, from the province of Bari. These are my father's parents, to Allentown, too. About the same time, both families moved to East Harlem. They never met in Allentown, but they met in East Harlem. And that's how the Marino clan in East Harlem basically started. So that's all my grandmother knew. She lived in the neighborhood for over 70 years. So she didn't want to go. But then my father and other relatives convinced her, your grandchildren, your grandsons getting involved in too many incidents around the neighborhood. We don't want to see anything really happen to any of them, right? They've been lucky so far.
So, for the curious listener or watcher, what did you get yourself into?
What did I get myself into? I was just going to wrap and say she finally got convinced, and that's when we moved at that time. What did I get myself into? I tried my best to steer away from incidents, and I'm going to say this, I never stole anything. I had my share of fights along the way, no question about that. There was a huge fight involving myself and a guy who was a good friend of mine, but things happened amongst friends too. In the spring of 1969, this is one thing I can remember, and I was 12 years old at the time. And my mother, when she passed away 3 years ago, one of the last things I said to her, I said, Ma, I don't regret anything I ever did in my life. If there is one thing I kind of regret is when she jumped in, and she was known as a tough customer around the neighborhood, my mother. People said I got it from her. My mother happened to be passing by. She was notified of the fight going on. She jumped in. My friend's cousins, his two cousins, jumped in, who were about 10 years older than us at that time and were well known and well respected around the neighborhood. And they jumped in and tried to break us all up. And everything seemed to be broken up. And then at the last second, I said, and I hardly ever lost a fight, but I had lost this one. And I said, I'm not going home here losing this fight after this was a real battle royal. This was. I took my left hand, and I'm what I call semi-ambidextrous. I do about 60% of things right-handed, about 60%, about 40% left-handed. And one of the things I know how to do is I know how to throw a punch. I did a little boxing when I was young. I know how to throw a punch left-handed. And I just reached around with a solid left hook, and I have to say it, I clocked him and stunned him, and I won the fight based off that. And I told my mother that is one thing I regret. And my mother, I didn't even think she'd remember it all those years later, from 1969 to the end of 2019 when she passed away, 50 years. And she said, amazingly, she said, I was glad you did that. That was my mother. So I had that happen. You had your offers to do things around the neighborhood. In a neighborhood like that, where the crime rate is high, you can imagine some of the offers I had. I found, you'd walk around, you'd find weapons on the street. You'd find one day I found a little one-shot Derringer, not loaded, and laying on top of the sewer in the street one day. One day I found a huge slingshot, and this was about 10 slingshots in one. I would say size-wise, just kind of, it was so big I can't even like do it with my hands on the screen. And the area you pulled the slingshot from was huge and massive. And honestly, you could have seriously hurt somebody with that. I found that on the street one day too. Just walking along on the street with friends, and kind of things you'd find on the street. But I passed up those offers too. I was more afraid of my parents than I was of the cops back then. And I think that's what parenting has to be. And my parents laid that out to me and my brother, that if you ever get in any trouble, you're going to hate dealing with us more than you would do, let's say, with the authorities. So
I know
good
that
example. Yeah, and that gets your attention. Or if you tried certain things and you got caught by your parents or my parents, and they laid the law down, and they laid down what the punishment would be, they stuck to it. For example, right before one of the incidents that convinced them we have to move and go now, late summer 72, I wound up getting mugged with a couple of friends. But I have violated my parents' rules of how to comport myself in certain situations on the street. And I was involved in a big incident where I got thrown, where I had a knife put up to my right side. I got thrown into a doorway, through a door. I got thrown up against a glass window first of a storefront, as did my friends, my cousin too. And we got all pushed, overpowered, because we didn't have any weapons, but they did, into a doorway. And my friend got clocked really good, went down in one shot. And then I was the guy who chased the guys who mugged us down the street. My cousin tended to my friend who was down when everything broke up. And I ran out of the doorway on the street. I ran through a crowd of about 300 people. And I think to show the kind of respect I had in the neighborhood, I was good friends with the vice president of the karate division of the Black Spades. His name was Jose Ramos. He lived in the South Bronx, and we worked for an anti-poverty program in the neighborhood together 50 years ago. And he just happened to be passing by, and he found out what happened, and he rounded up the Black Spades to go get these guys for what they did to me and my cousin and my friend, who he was also who he knew and was friendly with too. I think that's the kind of respect I had on the streets in the neighborhood back then. Those are some of the things we got into at that time. And I always knew don't cross a certain line because I would be made to pay for it. But after we got mugged, my father took me to the police precinct. And then when we got home, he said, I'm proud of you for what you did and the way you went through the pictures and everything, see if you could identify anybody. He said, but you violated my rules of what the rules were. He said, you grounded for a week. And he meant a week. He didn't mean like 6 days and 23 hours and 59 minutes. He meant 7 days, 24 hours a day. And I found out. And fortunately for me, I'm going to say this, I'm glad that happened, because then the incident on top of that, where my parents said, we're out of here. We just have to go find a place in the Bronx where all the Italians went in Pelham Bay, basically. And I had relatives up in this neighborhood here already. What happened was there was a big incident involving somebody who crossed the paths of certain friends of mine. Not even going to say 50 years later what happened. But after that incident, I put it this way, I would have been involved in that incident probably if I wasn't grounded. On that same day, at that very time, that week, the movie Superfly came out in 1972, Curtis Mayfield. And my father he always took one vacation week during the summer, and that was his vacation week. So him, my mother, and my brother went to the movie theater on 86th Street, right next door to the Papaya King, which is a very famous papaya juice and hot dog institution in New York City. They just closed up recently, matter of fact, after being around for 70, 80 years or whatever or more, and run by Greek immigrants. And they were in the theater when this incident happened. I got stashed up my aunt's house in the neighborhood because I wasn't allowed to hang out with my friends that day, and I sure as heck wasn't going to the movies with them because I was punished. And because I was in the house with my aunt that day during the incident, I was not involved, and thankfully so.
So it all worked out in a way. It was a blessing.
It worked out. It worked out. I've never really been a believer in things happen for a reason until the last several years. I see that, and I look back at that. Maybe that's why I got mugged. Happened for a reason. I got to not be there when this happened and not be involved in that.
So it was like the wake-up call pretty much, huh?
Yeah, it was. You're a kid on a street in a neighborhood like that. I remember being on a basketball court one day and looking at some of the guys who were the Italian guys who were, quote, involved, unquote, which means they did some things that, you shouldn't be doing, obviously. And they were pretty well known, around New York City at that time. I was 15 years old. They were in their mid-20s. And we were watching them play basketball one day. And they would usually kind of watch us. And I looked at them and I said, these guys, they think they know everything about life. I'm 15 and I know as much as them. What do they know? I found out at 15, I didn't know anything. Maybe I was just a stupid kid on the streets. Or I think back to some of the stories on the basketball court that I tell frequently with my involvement with high school basketball around the tri-state area here. I tell people I know at different schools the kind of things my father would say to me to make sure I stayed on the straight and narrow. For example, when I was a freshman in high school, I'm on the court one day and I have a ball in my hand, and it was after a game. I was smiling, had a good game. My father walked up to me and he said, two of my friends grew up to play in the NBA, which they did, from the neighborhood in East Harlem. One was a famed character actor. He quit the NBA to become an actor. Real good-looking guy, Jim Luisi. He was a heavy in the late 60s and most of the 70s. I remember him specifically on the FBI at least once, if not more. He's a real notorious looking character actor. The other guy was Zeke Sinicola, who was NBA Rookie of the Year. I think the 53-54 season he played at Niagara University, and he was a point guard. He was slightly bigger than me. I met him one day in the winter of 1970 on the corner of 113th and 2nd Avenue. And Zeke was only in the NBA for like 3 years. Nobody knew why he really bombed out of the league after that point. About 5 years ago, the New York Times ran a story about Zeke Sinicola, talking to some of his former teammates about how, he was greatly talented. Nobody to this day could really figure out why he bombed out of the NBA after 3 years, I think it was, and he had been Rookie of the Year. I think it was the 53-54 season. But my father said, two of my friends grew up to play in the NBA. He said, you'll never play in the NBA. which he was making a point to me at that point. I said, he walked away. I stood there with the ball in my hand. I was like, I'm not. I guess I got to go figure out. He would know. I guess I got to go figure out something else to do. And that helped put me on my path to where I am today. Among other things that happened on the basketball court, stories about my father I could tell you where he let me know where it's at. And he proved it to me one day on the court at the age of 15, I had a big game on the street. So we, played in the, I call it loose street league around the neighborhood in East Harlem. And I was a sharpshooter. I got to a point second year in high school where I knew I wasn't a point guard anymore, and guys were growing bigger than me, and I wasn't quick enough, and I didn't have the handle with my right hand. The left hand I did. And to this day, I probably still don't have the right handle with my right hand. But I said, I got to learn how to shoot here, and I found out I could shoot. And then I had a big game on the street one day, and my father was watching and came over to me at the end of the game. He said, listen, you had a good game today. And I said, yeah. He said, you scored a lot of points, right? I said, yeah, knocking them down. He said, yeah. He said, you are. He said, you're lucky. He said, everybody loves you here today. He said, how about the days when you're not knocking them down? He said, you seem to think you're the best option on every play. He said, that's not what I taught you growing up. He said, you're not the best option on every play. He said, you just happen to be hitting all your shots today. He said, you think everybody would have crowded around you after the game if you went maybe 3 for 15 instead of like 11 for 15? And he said, show me on the court that you know how to play the game the way I taught you, that you know how to move the ball around the way I taught you. He said, then I'll come over and say, all right, good game. And then the following year, my junior year in high school, we had just moved up to Pelham Bay here in the Bronx. And we moved on March 23rd. It was a Friday. A couple of weeks later, it was a cold Saturday morning. And my father said, and I was a junior in high school, he said, hey, let's go to the court in Pelham Bay Park. Said, you against me, one-on-one. I said, yeah, he's how old? 43 or whatever now? And I'm 16, and you know what? All right. I said, yeah, let's go, Pop. And we went on the court, and I hit a couple of shots, and I missed one. And he shot the old NBA style, like his friends were, a two-hand set shot. My father grew up shooting, and he still had that in his early 40s in East Harlem, where if you played one-on-one, you stepped behind the foul line, you took the ball out there, and the defender, the guy in defense, was not allowed to step or run past the foul line. You could jump past it, but you couldn't step or run past it. So advantage the guy who could really shoot from long distance, like NBA three-point range today. And I hit a couple, and I missed one. I said, this may not be good because I think he's looking to beat me here today. My father went back. He went bang, bang, bang from like today's NBA range where I could jump back then, and he knew it. And he was back far enough where he knew I couldn't get to the ball. So I'd be jumping futilely, hit a whole bunch in a row. He missed one. I hit a couple more. And then he grabs the rebound. He drives the lane, hits me with an elbow, and he goes up with a layup and hits it. I said, foul. And he said, foul. He said, I watch you foul guys all the time, and you claim where we come from, there's no such thing as a foul. No harm, no foul. No foul. So my ball. That's what you say all the time. He said, so my ball now. Basket counts. I said, but he said, give me the ball. Runs it back. He does the exact same thing, hits me with a harder elbow this time, banks the shot in underneath. And I said, foul. He said, give me the ball. I gave him the ball. He walked back behind the line. He went bang, bang, bang. The game was over. He followed up the last shot, caught it on one bounce as it went through the basket, bounced past me. I was stunned, grabbed the ball, had it in his right arm, and he said, next Saturday, same time. I said, Pop, a week from Monday, I got this really big test in school. Kind of already planned to study next weekend. He said, okay. He said, whenever you want to do it again, let me know. I'll see you when you get home.
He humbled you.
And that taught me where, like we used to say back then, that's where it's at.
He humbled you.
He did twice, just to make his point. Not once, but twice. I said, foul. Both times he said, give me the ball. And what he said was right the first time. He said, you foul guys all the time. Or like he once told me, gee, it's funny when I watch you on defense, funny how your elbows sometimes seem to come up at just the right time. I said, oh, you noticed? He said, yeah, I noticed. He said, don't worry. He said, people notice when you do that. He said, you get away with it. He said, but people know.
I like his teaching style.
Yeah, and that's, like he told me growing up in the neighborhood, he said, "I'm not your friend. I can't be your friend. Maybe when, we both get older and you're an adult, we can be friends then. But I'm your parent. I'm your father." He said, "I can't be your friend. I'm not your friend."
So he's your teacher.
And I always respected that.
Yeah. So let's kind of dig more into your education outside of sports. How was school?
Right? Right. High school was the old St. Agnes High School on East 44th Street between 3rd and Lex. In the 90s, St. Agnes went to rebuild the facility and everybody it was an all boys school. We were and forevermore are the Stags. If you go to my Facebook page, which I have it up for professional reasons, the one thing I do on there is one thing gladly did join the St. Agnes Facebook page. And I wrote a long history of our crew and everything we did in our graduation year, 74, just a few days ago. Got a lot of reaction to it. I was glad about that. And hooked up with about 12 to 15 guys I went to St. Agnes with back then. And this is where I say, here's where my career began. I went to St. Anne's Grammar School in East Harlem. And that was on 110th Street. And that kind of combined, the grammar schools in the neighborhood had to combine because of lack of enrollment in the last few years. They combined with trying to remember it's either St. Lucy's on 104th or St. Paul's on 117th Street. One or the other, they're combined with nowadays. That happened a few years ago. But in the 8th grade in St. Anne's, now the neighborhood was mostly Puerto Rican, good amount of African American, and like I said, just a vestige of the Italian community, a handful of Irish were around the neighborhood also then too. We had the Whalens, the Kilcullens, the Milburns. I could think of about 5 Irish families. And they all basically, most of them kids attended St. Anne's. One of them was one of my best friends, Kevin Kilcullen. What happened was in the 8th grade, we had this youth group called TIA, Teenagers in Action. It was run by a really well-respected, one of the best-known African Americans in the neighborhood, Bruce Johnson. And the guy who ran it with him was Norris McAdoo. Norris McAdoo's daughter, Gail, was 3 years younger and was a good friend of my brother. They attended St. Anne's together. And my father wanted me off the streets. So he went to Bruce Johnson and he said, "My son is yours. Do whatever you have to do to keep him off the streets. It's all yours." And we met every Sunday morning. So they came up with the idea that with the upcoming PTA meeting, they would take a Puerto Rican kid, a black kid, and an Italian kid, and have each one of us make a speech to the PTA. The Italian kid selected was me. Again, the Italian kid selected was me. So they said, you seem to have a lot of friends, you're personable, that's why we picked you. So I had to come up with some topics. I came up with 2 topics. Let's see if I can remember. One was why the U.S. should not be in the Vietnam War. And the other was at the age of 13, why I thought 18-year-olds should be given the right to vote. It was 21 at that time. And as I made that speech, I said to myself, 18-year-olds, I'm 13. I think I should have the right to vote. That's what went through my head when I made that speech. But my mother was able to come. My father couldn't come that night. And I got walked home that night by Father Louis Giganti, who was attending. Father Louis Giganti died recently. His brother was the famed mafia boss, Vinny the Chin Giganti, the guy who'd walk around in the bathrobe all the time. And Father Giganti was one of the leaders in building housing in substandard communities around New York City at that time. And he had housing still exists. You could drive by be on the elevated Bruckner Expressway in the South Bronx and see the SEBCO, SCBCO houses right by the elevated Bruckner if you're going southbound where it starts by Hunts Point and Longwood Avenues. And that was his housing from back then. And he happened to attend. He walked myself, my mother, and one of my mother's friends home that night, the famed Father Giganti. That's where my career started, actually. And then the second kick off to my career came when I entered high school, St. Agnes, a few months later, and we were across the street, located on 44th from the old E.J. Corvettes. E.J. Corvettes was New York City department store, famed New York City department store of the old days. They all disappeared in the 80s, I guess, but Corvettes was still there, and they had my favorite record department in that store. So I would sneak out most every day during free period, going to Corvettes, even though I wasn't supposed to. Nobody was supposed to leave the building. Hang out in there. They published the updated record charts every week according to their sales figures and ratings, whatever. And I would, read that religiously and, buy records every week, buy 45s every week and some albums too. Back then, I remember when my mother said, "You got to buy me Santana's Abraxas album." That came out like late 1970 with all the great artwork on it. So I bought that for her. And I remember she liked the Israeli song in the spring of 71, Bashana, Bashana, Haba. I had to buy that for her too. And I thought I was getting away with something. That's when, but I do say that my career began there too, by going to Corvettes all the time. When I graduated in 1974, there were some incidents. There was a big incident actually involving, right after I had moved to the Bronx in late 73, some of my old Italian-American friends in the neighborhood with some of my Irish-American friends from St. Agnes who lived in what I know they call it the Upper East Side now. That's Yorkville to us. They lived on the Upper East Side in the 70s and the 80s back then. And a big incident happened, and I got called in by the principal, Marist brother Richard Rancourt. And Brother Richard said, "Sit down." And this was after Easter break, 73, right after we had just moved to the Bronx. He said, "You know what happened." Or he said, "I know you know what happened. I know you know everybody involved in it. Were you there?" I said, "No, I was not there." He said, "Good." He said, "I didn't think you would be involved in something like that, but I have to check anyway." And then he said to me in that same meeting, he said, "Oh, by the way," and this is what I was getting up to leave. And he said, "I know that, you think that nobody ever noticed you walking out of the building every day for these 3 years when you go to Corvettes every day, even though you're not supposed to." He said, "Well," I said, "What, you know?" He said, "Yeah, of course." Said, "I watch you every day. I've watched you every day for 3 years. Go in there." He said, "Don't worry about it. So long as you stay out of trouble, I'm not going to say anything."
Wow.
That's had Brother Richard put the kibosh on it in freshman year when that was his first year too in school, and he took a lot of heat. He was the guy who
because somebody had a BB gun and shot me with it.
Oh,
So
no.
I chased
Okay,
him.
welcome back from the commercial break. Before we went to break, he was talking about how his principal caught him and knew about him going to Corvettes.
Yeah, and Brother Richard was the guy who, when we were freshmen, we had to come in properly dressed every day to high school. That was the tradition in St. Agnes. We had to wear not exactly a suit, but a dress shirt, dress pants every day. And he changed it when we went to Easter break in spring of 71. He said, for the entire school, he announced over the loudspeaker one day, "Oh, by the way, when you guys come back, the dress code is changed. You don't have to look so formal every day. Just come in presentable, and that's fine. No sneakers or anything like that, but come in presentable with a nice shirt. It doesn't have to be a dress shirt. A nice pair of pants. Doesn't have to be, what looks like suit pants or anything like that. Nice, good pair of shoes, and you're all set. As long as you do that, we have no problem." And that's how the school changed under him. He was a pretty liberal principal, where before everything had been pretty rigid and run by the Marist brothers, which he was. But there was a change at that time in the brotherhood amongst the Marist brothers. For example, one of my good friends at St. Agnes, brother, needs to be referred to as brother. He says, Brother Michael Flanagan is a brother to this day at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, up the Hudson River. And the Marist brothers kind of interchanged between St. Agnes, Mount St. Michael, still a pretty prominent school in the Bronx, and Marist College also too. And Brother Michael Flanagan is to this day, at the age of 66, brother at Marist College.
All right, so would you say Corvettes, that was the first taste for your career?
Yeah, just being in that record department there. EJ Corvettes with a K. It's Corvette with a K and an apostrophe S at the end. Any old New Yorker would know what it was. Everybody went there. Like Horn and Hardart, you went there for the hot dogs and the Knish back in the old days.
So how long was it after you graduated before you started, doing classes for radio?
As soon as I got to Fordham University, I signed up as a communications major, And I had a plan that I wasn't going to join the college radio station until the third year because I wanted to knock off. There were in the journalism course, and I was told, well, I want to do radio. I said, and they said, well, here we don't teach you radio, we teach you journalism. And then with that, you can go do whatever you want in the media at that point. They were right. They taught me all different kinds of styles of writing for radio and TV and for newspapers and how in magazines, how it was all different. And right away, I said, I'm going to knock most of these classes off within the first 2 years, stick mostly to the communications department the first 2 years, and take most of my electives after that. And then I can go do the radio station, which I did middle of junior year, near the end of 1976. So I did focus on religion too, besides communications. I wanted to get those done. And I was exposed to a variety of different religions by Father Theodore. Now I'm forgetting his name. Eldridge, was it? I forget. My apologies to late father if I did forget his name. But he taught a variety of different religions. And so I studied Catholicism, I studied Judaism, I studied Islam and Hinduism under him. And for a while, I had my doubts about the man above. I had a nice talk with him one day, and he showed me the man above does exist, which I think he does watch everything we do. I told you before we did the show, I've been in 5 major car accidents. Here I am. I couldn't be that lucky.
No.
That's because the man above allowed me to be here today. At the age of 16, my stupid friends at that time, this was after we had all moved up from East Harlem, and still a few still lived in the neighborhood, and everybody decided we're going to go to Rye Playland in Westchester County one day. And nobody knew how to swim. Rye Playland is still very popular to this day in Westchester County. Great place to bring the family, etc. It's always being rebuilt, but you can still go there. And Rye Playland had an area where you were able to take boats out and kind of paddle along the lagoon along the Long Island Sound. If you get out of it, you'd be in Long Island Sound. None of us knew how to swim, but everybody said, we're going to go out there on the lagoon in these boats. And I said, I'm not going. And one of the girls we hung out with, Nina, said, I'm not going either. Now, I was into fishing at that time. Not that I fished a lot. I would when I would visit my cousins on Long Island and go out off the shore of Port Jefferson, fish a little bit. But I knew currents and I knew waves. I'd studied that on my own for a few years since I was 12 or 13 years old. I knew how currents ran. So my idiotic friends, and I hate to say that, but this was an idiotic decision amongst us to do this, go out and they get trapped in the boats in the lagoon. And I was running along the shoreline. I told Nina, you stay here. I ran along the shoreline with them and guided them around this, around that. They finally beached. There was a small island out in the lagoon. They beached out there on the island, the 2 boats, got back in, decided they were going to change boats. Everybody in one boat on the water was going to jump in the other, and vice versa. The boat started to tip over.
Mm-hmm.
The boat started to tip. And luckily, the boat straightened out and nobody fell into the water.
Because that would have been
although a couple of people were ready to. Now, by the time I got there for that, running along the shoreline, I ran into an area that said, restricted, do not enter along the shore. And it was all roped off. And I said, I got to keep up with them. How am I going to do this? If I run all the way around, I may not keep up with them, and the boat may tip or something may happen. So I lifted up the rope and started to go under the restricted area. And I heard a guy yell out to me, and I turned. It was a construction guy in a hard hat. And the guy said, hey, read the sign. What I didn't read on the sign was that it said, restricted area, do not enter. And underneath it said quicksand.
Uh-oh.
Had that guy not yelled that out, I might have gone into the quicksand. I look at that as the man above having that guy step in right there for me. And other incidents along the way, too. Growing up in the neighborhood, here's an incident that happened on a Sunday afternoon back in the late 60s. I was in my room near the window. My mother came in to tell me something. We both walked out together and we heard a ping. And we said, what the heck was that? The next morning in my window, we found BB pellets. We had little holes in the glass that just missed the two of us.
Wow.
BB pellets fired by a high-powered rifle from the building across the way. We were on the 8th floor, and they were fired into my window, my room, and the neighbor's window, too, by a guy up on the 11th or 13th floor or whatever. They caught the guy. So that's another instance of the man above, I think, stepping in and allowing me and, us to be here today. So it was, journalism was the focus at Fordham University, and religion was early on, too. And that's where I said, I want to be on the radio for sure. I know that now. And I began to work third year at WFUV radio.
Hold on,
the
wait,
first
wait.
FM
Before we
station-
continue,
yeah, first FM radio station
would
in the
you
country.
now, as you look back at your career and you see that you jumped into the religion, aren't you kind of happy that you did that as you reflect back on some of those memories?
Without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. And I do think, like I said, I do think now some things at least do happen for a reason based on my life experiences. I think that little doubt got put in my head there for a reason, maybe, but I spoke with Father and, he showed me, the man above does exist. And he said, that's one of the reasons why you're in the class, maybe to have that faith, reestablished here too. And I hope I can do that for you. And that's what he did at that time. So, being in the journalism department, I had some pretty tough professors. Father Donald Matthews, who had come in from USC, was among them, and Father Raymond Schroth, who had a fight for his tenure at Fordham. He just passed away a couple of years ago, but Father Schroth was the toughest and best journalism professor I could have ever asked for. Father Schroth would give no one an A, neither would Donald Matthews, neither would Father Matthews too. At the end of junior year, Father Matthews gave us a project where you pick it. Basically, it was kind of a doctorate for him. You had to do. It was like a doctorate when you did a paper in his class. And I selected a topic. The topic was that I would go around to newsstands in different neighborhoods around New York City and show how the content on the newsstands reflected the ethnic and economic backgrounds of the people in the neighborhood. And I put together what I would consider to be a Father Matthews thesis at that time. And he gave me an A. I said, I'm getting an A from this guy, even though he doesn't give them. He gave me an A. When I signed up for my communications courses at the beginning of senior year, who was on the line doing the signing up? Father Matthews. Father Matthews would say hello to no one. I remember walking by him during a snowstorm in 77 when I was in that class with him. I went to the campus one day and walked by him in a snowstorm, and he was just in thought. I said, hello, Father, how are you? And he went, hello, and he just kept walking. I was one of his students at that time. Here he was on that line 6 months later, and when he looked up and saw me, and he said, oh, by the way, Marino, he said, that was some paper you wrote. I said, thank you, Father. I got the A. Father Raymond Schroth demanded that besides people would tell Father Schroth, we understand your course load and what you're trying to do with us, but we have other courses too besides you. In my semester with him, I hung out once the second night of the semester with my friends. I never hung out again. And another incident happened, big incident in this neighborhood here in Pelham Bay. At that time, we were up here by then, my second year of high school, that my friends were involved in. And thanks to the fact that Father Schroth overloaded us with work, I was not involved in that. I was studying or, doing the project or writing whatever it was instead on that night. It's a legendary incident that we joke about today. This happened in 1976 or so, all these years later. It's still a joke. All these years later is something that happened in that luckily everybody turned out okay. But Father Schroth got his tenure after I was at Fordham, and a lot of his former students fought for him because we saw what he did for us. He demanded that besides the overloaded coursework that took our attentions from our other courses too at that time, that you had to read article or book upon book or whatever, and keep a running chart, flow chart of everything you read. And then halfway through the course during the Easter vacation that year, this was a year before Father Matthews, you had to meet with him in his dorm at Fordham, in the Jesuits' dorm. So I go in there, I had a list of like 18 or 19 articles on there, and he looked at it and he flipped it back at me and he said, Marino, he said, not enough reading. I said, what do you mean not enough reading? I said, it's like 18, 19 articles besides everything you give us. We do have 3 or 4 other classes to everybody. He said, for me, for this class, that's not enough reading. He said, what do you want to do with yourself? I said, I want to be on the radio. And he said, well, go to Montana, go get a job on a radio station there and work your way back this way if you want to work here. It'll take you a few years, but go work your way back. And he said, otherwise, this is how we educate you in the communications and journalism department at Fordham University. And he said, we're going to do this again at the end of the year, and you better have some reading done here. So in the second half of the year, I think I added 24 more articles and a couple of books to the list too. At the end, we met again, and he said, okay, he said, that's what I'm looking for.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Yep. But that helped get me to where I am today and what I've done in my career because of Father Matthews and Father Schroth.
Yeah.
They were tough love guys, but it was worth it.
And that's what I was looking at. Like, you had great mentors. You could have had
no
somebody
question about that. They demanded from you. One other guy I'm going to mention, and this was sophomore year, fall semester, 1975, with Daniel Mack. He was a lay teacher, Daniel Mack. He had light brown curly hair with wire-rimmed glasses, and Daniel Mack was going to teach us a particular style of writing. Newspaper writing is what he taught. And the second week of class, he said, okay, he said, we're going to pretend we're in a newsroom now. Here's your assignment. You write this up. And by the end of the class, whatever you got, that's what you're going to turn in. So we started up. And immediately he goes to sit down next to the guy seated right behind me. And he's got a newspaper in his hands, the New York Times or whatever. It was a long sheet newspaper. And he sits down, crosses his legs next to the guy, pulls up a seat next to him, and he starts reading out of the paper. Hey, look at this. Well, look at that. Chicken legs on sale, 15 cents a pound. I got to go get some. Oh, well, look at this. Wow. Oh, chocolate milk. I like that. Well, 20 cents for a can, whatever the prices were back then in 1975. The guy starts to look at him. And Daniel Mack puts the paper down, and he says, what? He says, do you think that because you have to get something done in a newsroom that everybody's going to stop just for you? And I paid attention to this, and he made sure everybody heard this. He said, nobody's stopping for you. He said, everybody's going to be there talking about their kids, their personal problems, what's on sale in the supermarket, et cetera, whatever it is might be going on in their lives. This is what you're going to face on an everyday situation. If you want to work in this business, get used to this right now, or you're going to be in the wrong business, kid. And I took that to heart right there. And I try to impart that to people who I see who work in other lines of work nowadays, and maybe they're in those lines of work for many years, maybe people with an office background who seemingly they can only really kind of work on one thing at one time. And if you maybe make some noise around them, they'll say, shut up. And I always tell them about that lesson from Daniel Mack in 1975, that really, whatever it is in life, what they call the noise nowadays, you got to forget about the noise and stay focused on whatever it is that you have to do.
Well said. Especially Daniel Mack, man. Well said.
I was going to say Daniel Mack, well said. No question about that. And that got my attention. And I did say to myself, I hope he's not coming here next. He did go bother somebody else on the other side of the room.
So,
yeah,
after you graduated, who was your first employer?
My first employer. Is funny you bring this up because I had to text somebody about that a little while ago. I'm the public address announcer for basketball and baseball at Bridgehampton High School on Long Island. And Bridgehampton is one of the top programs in state history, number 2 in championships won. And last night, the regular season concluded. They're off to the playoffs next week. And I'll be, I think, doing the games on the Bridgehampton High School TV circuit, which actually gets broadcast all throughout Suffolk County to every school system on Long Island. Working on putting that together, getting the proper approvals from St. Joseph's College in Patchogue, where we're going to be, and other sectional, higher ups who need to approve it as well too. But the opponent, or I should say the location, if they win next week, will be up in Orange County, about 70 miles from New York City, at Seward Institute in Florida, New York. And that's where I began my career, down the road in Warwick, Florida, New York, at Seward Institute. A couple of doors down is, you may know the name Jimmy Sturr, the king of polka music. Jimmy Sturr's office for his music group and company, and he also runs a travel business too. He has since the 70s. His father founded Key Bank, which is popular in the Northeast. Jimmy Sturr grew up in Florida, New York, got involved in the polka business as a teenager, became the most famous polka artist ever. And I texted this to the athletic director at Bridgehampton. I said, if we wind up at Seward High School, what's called the sub-regional, if Bridgehampton wins next week, will be at Seward High as you move up the state line in Orange County in Florida, New York. I said, you're not going to believe this story. But I began my career right there with the guy right next door, Jimmy Sturr, who gave me my first job. He had just bought WTBQ radio in Warwick, next town down, 1110 on the AM dial. It's owned today by a good friend of Jimmy. He's still got his polka show on the station besides the national show. And a guy named Frank Truatt, who was one of our competitors back then at that time. And Frank owns the station now. And that's where I got my first job. Jimmy Sturr gave me job at Adult Contemporary, middle of the road, WTBQ in Warwick in June of 1979. The first song I ever played was the Stylistics, Betcha by Golly. Wow, I was supposed to play Seals and Crofts, I'll Play for You. And I loved Seals and Crofts, but not that song. There was a guy off the streets in Betcha by Golly. Wow, had an incident on the street, a good incident, on the day Willie Mays got traded to the Mets in 1972. There, where that song was involved, coming out of somebody's boombox at that time. I'll tell you the story. The Italian guys and the Puerto Rican guys and the black guys, we all had competing basketball teams around the neighborhood. And like I said, a loose league. And the Italian guys, we were on our court one day, and a couple of the Puerto Rican guys that I grew up with, Herminio Clementi and Manny Soto, who passed away at a young age, like a lot of guys I grew up with did. And like my father said, a lot of the guys you grew up with never had a chance to live their lives. Manny Soto passed away a decade later in 1983. But they came in to challenge us to a game. This was the day Willie Mays got traded to the Mets in 1972. And they walked in with, and I forget if it was Herminio or Manny, I think it was Herminio, had the boombox on his shoulder, and Betcha by Golly Well by the Stylistics was playing. It was a big hit then when they walked in to challenge us that day. And I said, if I ever get on the air, that's going to be the first song I play. So when nobody was looking, the guy who was on the air before me, Bob Neal, and he had set up, queued up. In the old days, you'd queue up records on the turntable and let them go and spin, not like, CDs eventually, or now, the way things are done, everything digital and from a computer. And while he wasn't looking, I took the needle off I'll Play for You. I found Betcha by Golly Wow. I racked it up. I said, here we go. And that's the first song I played on the air in 1979, all thanks to Jimmy Sturr. And this text message I sent out to the athletic director about an hour ago, right before we started at Bridgehampton High School. I said, that's my history. And I went from TBQ. I was lucky at the age of just before I turned 24, 23. I think I knew a lot about the business at a young age. I was able to go from WTBQ and farmland in Orange County. It's much more developed now, but still some farms there. I always remember the old Weslowski farm, the Weslowski farm in Polish, how I'd come down off Route 17, Route 94, and sometimes you had to watch for his cows in the roadway to drive around the cows. I almost hit one day. Matter of fact, I was going too fast, and one of them was like big bovine right in the middle of the road. I was like, oh, nice and slow. And I went around him. I was hoping he wouldn't kick out. I was a little late, so I couldn't wait for him to move. So I had to move around him. That's what, the way it was up there. And I went to programming and being the music director of a station in the Hamptons, the old WSBH FM, run by my old pal, Mel Kahn. Back then, he was the owner and president and general manager, too. And he gave me a chance as a 23, about to be 24-year-old kid to run his radio station in a pretty big market at that time. And I was always grateful for that. I remember during the interview with Mel, he'd ask me a question and I'd repeat it. And after a certain point, he said, tell me. He said, why do you repeat everything I say first before you actually answer my question? I said, probably because I really, really want this job. And he said, okay. And guess what? At the end of the interview, he said, you got the job.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was November of 1980, a day or two before my birthday. I was 23. I turned 24 a day or two after that. And I started out there just a couple of weeks later. And so I went from Warwick out to Southampton on the island. And that began in this text, I also said that began what I do today for you at Bridgehampton High began back then in 1980 when I went from my first job at WTBQ in Warwick to Bridgehampton. Ironically, if Bridgehampton wins next week, where do we play next? We're going to be up at Seward High School, right next door, a couple of doors down from Jimmy Stern, Florida, New York, where he still is today, the guy who began my career at WTBQ down the road in Warwick, which is it's still in the area. It moved to Sugarloaf in the town of Warwick. There's a little small community. It was an artists community back then in the late 70s and 1980, well-known Hudson Valley artists community at that time. And that's where the station is down the road nowadays, too, owned by our good pal, Frank Truatt. That's how I began and quickly moved up the ladder. And for 6.5 years, I was the program director, music director, hosted a variety of shows. We were an adult contemporary station. We did some Sunday morning Sinatra standards, which I hosted that. And eventually we moved out of that and into a classic rock show when new management came in. I knew when Mal sold the station, new management would keep me there for a while until they got acclimated. And come Memorial Day weekend in 87, they got acclimated enough to let me go. That same day, I had put an audition tape in the mail to place where I wanted to be. I knew my days were numbered there. I said, it's time to come back to the Bronx and be able to drive a short distance. And I liked living in the Hamptons back then, but I didn't get to do a lot because I ran the radio station all the time. And it was a different kind of a market out there on Long Island. For example, we were involved in helping promote Madonna and her.
So right then and there, you put that tape in the mail.
Here we go.
You knew what was going to happen.
I put that tape in the mail on that same day. I got fired earlier in the day, about 5 hours before. Here's what happened. I came out of the post office, and an old lady needed help crossing the street. Who helped her? I did. I said to myself, well, I helped an old lady across the street. Something good is supposed to happen, they say, if you do that, right? 5 hours later, I got fired. I said, well, maybe not. And then within a couple of days, I had 3 job offers from a station in WGCH in Greenwich, Connecticut, Chris Lucas, over next door at WSTC in Stamford, Connecticut with Bill White. I accepted the GCH job. I got off the phone and the phone rang and I thought it was Chris Lucas. I had just hung the phone up and turned away. I said, it's Chris calling me back. I guess he forgot to tell me something. It was WFAS calling to hire me, the place where I wanted to be, where I put the tape into. I accepted the job. I had to call Chris back and say, I appreciate it. Thank you. And, maybe we can do it again one day. He had no problem with that because the stations, people went back and forth working on both stations. Like if you're out of one, you'd be in the other. So I guess he figured, if you're out of FAS one day, you'll be here. And even the engineers for both stations kind of worked in both places actually too. So the chief engineer, Clark Burgard, was a veteran of both places, and some other engineers and background people too. They kind of went back and forth between both stations. So that's how I wound up in Westchester and FAS. I got made sports director when opening for that came up. Led the way to me getting onto the air at WCBS 880 in the city, first to WABC in the city, anchoring sports, over to 1010 Wins, WCBS 880 for 10 years. After that, I had a couple of separate stints on Bloomberg Radio, WBBR's sports anchor. In the meantime, I was disc jockeying. I was at FAS we had converted to talk in the late 80s. I was hosting a talk show on FAS in the afternoons. I'd done mornings for a few years, then went to PM Drive. I was hosting the PM Drive show on FAS in the afternoon talk show. I was filling in and doing weekends at WHLI on Long Island in the mid-90s at the same time. And then I was done on ABC and then got my foot in the door at 1010 Wins. And then right after that, wound up on CBS. I was doing all of them at the same time, and then filling in on Jukebox Radio in North Jersey and to WMTR Radio, which was standards as oldies nowadays in North Radio too. I was actually at 5 places somehow at one time.
Now, like, okay, being 40 years in radio,
Right.
how much would you say it has changed since you've been in it?
Very, very much. A lot of the elements from day one are still the same, I think. I really do. I think a lot of the elements from day one and why people get into the business are very much the same. I got into the business because I listened to the radio as a kid. Music was all around me growing up. My father was a standard singer back in the late 40s, early mid 50s, got to the Arthur Godfrey show and never went on because of a fight with the producers that kind of ended his career, actually. My father was a standards guy, still is, still puts on TV the Sirius at the age of 94, the Sirius Standards channel every single day and listens and watches and listens to it. My mother was an R&B fan and a little bit of a country fan, an Elvis fan too. So I had everything around. And my mother was into the Beatles from day one. My father got into it eventually, and they both were obviously, being from the neighborhood, into R&B and the old, Sam Cooke and, Lou Rawls, who I got to be friends with before he passed away for a few years. We used to hang out together from time to time at the Carlisle Hotel in Manhattan. Lou Rawls was a great guy, a great individual, and proud to say that he was, before he passed away. We were friends for several years. But, it's the background of the Spinners, Stylistics, the whole family was into all of that. The story about going to see Superfly and Curtis Mayfield with Freddie's Dead and Superfly, I think that sums it all up, what it was like for my parents, too, being from the neighborhood. And me not being allowed to go with them that day helped save me from an incident. But I heard when I was 15, and, I knew I wasn't going to play in the NBA, and I said, I got to figure out something else to do. I started listening to WABC radio, the old legendary top 40 station in the city. I used to listen to WMCA before that, but they went talk in the summer of early fall of 1970. I used to listen to the legendary, probably one of the first major influential African-American disc jockeys in this country. And I used to listen to Frankie at night on MCA, and he used to sign off every night with the old King Pleasures song. There I go, there I go, there I go, there I go. And he'd say something really clever at the end of the show every night. And that hooked me first. So MCA ended music. They went talk. They had on Alex Bennett at night, who had come in from San Francisco. He may have been a Brooklyn guy originally, I forget. Barry Farber in the early days. Bob Grant came to New York City at that time, the legendary Bob Grant, who I got to work with his son-in-law at WMTR there in the mid-90s in New Jersey. His son-in-law was the news director, actually, at that time. And this was obviously 25 years later. And I put on ABC, which I had listened to a little in the late 60s because they carried the Jets game. Then the Jets did win a Super Bowl. I did see it. I listened to all the playoff games on ABC, and I did see them. I was the only kid in the neighborhood who said they would win the Super Bowl. They were 21-point underdogs. And one other friend of mine, Freddie Figueroa, said it too, that Jets would win. And everybody thought I was crazy. I said, no, watch, they're going to win. And they did. But after the Jets left ABC, went over to MCA, and then MCA bagged music, and then I went back to ABC for music. And I started to hear this guy. I really started to listen to him then, even though he was on ABC before. Guy by the name of Ron Lundy. Ron Lundy was one of the most legendary disc jockeys ever. And I listened to him, and I knew he was from the South. But he was as New York as anybody could be. He was from the South, no question about that. Hello, love. Welcome. It's 10 o'clock, 10 a.m., in the greatest city in the world. And yet he was so New York with everything he said and everything he did too. And that's what my hook was. And then a second hook was, from listening to a radio standpoint, second hook was right after we moved here in 1973. And this was an odd move considered at that time by my high school, St. Agnes. They did not give us Election Day off. They did not give us other holidays off for the first half of the year. And they said, we're going to bunch holidays together with Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday, and you're going to get 4 or 5 days off at once. And they did that. So a couple of times during those, had those holidays not been bunched together, I may not be here today. So I slept late every morning, and I woke up 10 o'clock every morning during that 5-day stretch and turned on Ron Lundy as soon as he went on. And twice during that stretch, once at 10 o'clock and once at 11 o'clock, he began the hour with my favorite song at that time, the Diamonds from the late 50s, Little Darlin'. You know that song?
Yes, I do.
Little Darlin' from the late 50s by the Canadian group The Diamonds. And he began that first morning with Little Darlin' at 10 a.m. The next day, he played it at 11 o'clock in the morning. And each time behind it came on a big hit at that time, Edward Bear. These were both Canadian groups, the Diamonds and Edward Bear. Diamonds were from the Toronto area. Edward Bear, I think they were from Manitoba. That could have been Ontario, but maybe it was Ontario. But the Edward Bear group with "This is the last song I'll ever write for you," and it had a horn that come on there, boo boop, and him playing those two back to back, those 2 days in a row. That's where I said, that's what I got to do. If I'm not going to play in the NBA, that's what I want to do.
Perfect.
And I listened to him religiously through 1982 when ABC folded, and later when he appeared on WCBS FM, 84, he landed there until the day he retired in 1997.
All right. As we begin to wrap this thing out, if you decided not to pursue going into the radio industry or being a reporter, where do you think you would have ended up?
I probably would have, and I worked at Citibank during college throughout, just, to have a job, obviously, and to learn something. Might have become a banker. I might have, maybe beyond that. I was at Citibank the end of my college days when they opened up this new computer area. Computers were just beginning to get big at that time, and I worked in that area for a while. I found out that wasn't for me, and if I had any doubts about doing radio or getting into journalism, etc., and people who know me in this business know I'm not a computer guy. I'm not a high-tech guy. I have a flip phone. I use a flip phone to this day. A new flip phone, they still make new models, but I use a flip phone to this day. I'm not very literate in all this Zoom stuff and whatever, and the stuff I do, like nowadays, for example, I work for, you see my sign behind me, Shark Creative, Westchester Talk Radio. That is a network of stations under the Shark Creative banner of all people who work together at WFAS in White Plains. From the 80s to 2014, we all passed through there at one point and worked with our sales manager, Andrew Castellano, who's the owner and CEO of Shark Creative. And what I do with that, I have an engineer whose name is Michael Blakey, who guides me through everything, set everything up, taught me how to use Zoom and all this stuff. When the pandemic began, you had to learn all this stuff back then. I didn't know a thing about it. Andrew said, well, we're going to do everything on Zoom. I said, what's that? He said, talk to Mike. He'll teach you everything you need to know. And he did. So I'm not a high-tech guy. So anybody who knows me knows I'm not a computer guy, and it's better that I got out of the computer department there at Citibank and went into radio when I did, because that would not have been for me.
All right.
So besides this Shark Creative, work I do also, and all these talk shows I do, which you can access online. We have our own YouTube channel. We have we're on Apple Podcasts too. And I also, write and produce for the Total Traffic Network, what used to be Shadow Traffic, got into the traffic reporting and writing business after my CBS traffic days. And then from there, I'm still there years later today. In between, I stepped out for a few years to host the morning show at WVOX in New Rochelle for a couple of years, which is in Westchester, and came back to Total Traffic and appear on the air from time to time, occasionally on Big Hits 98.1 on Long Island, where I still get to disc jockey today. And the format is oldies, classic hits, basically the stuff that I played back in the 80s with some 70s and 60s too.
So if they look you up on YouTube, what's the channel called?
That would be Shark Creative. And you see back here, SHARC, Shark with a C, and Creative. So it's Shark Creative with 2 C's, Shark Creative YouTube. And you can also find us on Apple Podcasts too. We have our own app, Westchester Talk. Do I know how to use it? No, but I know it exists and it gets us out there. So, and all kinds of, we're all over Facebook. The company has 1,000 Facebook pages and LinkedIn pages, and Westchester Talk Radio, and Putnam and Rockland and Dutchess and Orange and Fairfield County, Connecticut Talk Radio. We all have our own LinkedIn and Facebook pages, and my own LinkedIn and Facebook page. Everything I do goes up on there too. So we have a vast, extensive social media network. Like I say, I don't know much about it. I think we do stuff on Twitter too. That's above my pay grade. That's a Mike Blakey pay grade kind of a thing too. And thank God we have him. I know I'm a pest sometimes from his end on the engineering side, but he puts it together and makes it all work.
So if anybody wants to connect to you, how can they do that?
That's an interesting question. You can go find me on Facebook under John Marino, and you'll see the radio background up top. It'll mention what I do nowadays, Total Traffic in Westchester Talk Radio and Big Hits, etc. And I won't have a picture on there because I don't know how to put one up. That's simple. And you'll find me on LinkedIn also too, John Marino, under the same kind of headings, radio, and everything I do. You will see a picture from summer of 2017 where I was about 40, 45 pounds heavier then than I am right now. So you'll see me with a big cheeky smile up there. I think I have a smile now, but not so much in the cheeks anymore during the pandemic. I know a lot of people gained weight. I set out to lose weight. I went from about 202 pounds down to 148. Now I'm settled back in about the mid 160s.
So how did you end up losing all that weight?
I learned a long time ago. I thought this. I found out during the pandemic, this is true, that whatever diet or whatever fad you think is the next great thing, it may not be for you. You individually have to find out what works for you, no matter what anybody else tells you. So you, me, and a third person.
A person makes their macaroni and cheese is such a blank canvas. It's a very blank canvas. I have made many things.
Another commercial break. All right, we're beginning to wrap this thing up. John was telling you how to connect to him.
Yeah, I mentioned all the connections there. And on LinkedIn, like I was saying about the diet and difference in the look and the different pictures, what works for what I was saying was, you can take you, me, and a third person, give us the same diet. I may lose 8 pounds, you may lose 12 pounds. The third guy says, I gained 22. And that's what I see about diets. They affect different people in different ways. So how did I lose all this weight? I learned not to eat so much. First of all, I basically eat once a day, whereas I ate at least 3 times a day before. I ate good stuff mostly, but somebody told me a few years back, it doesn't matter if you eat good stuff. If you eat too much of that too, you will gain the weight. You will not lose the weight. And they were right about that. So I really condensed down. I try to eat around 5 p.m. every day. And I may have a moderate meal. I may have a bigger meal. I might, very rare, do I have anything earlier in the day. I did have a half of a Napoleon, an Italian pastry, my favorite. Those are very fattening. I had half of a Napoleon today just because it was in the house and I want to start to get rid of it. So no whole Napoleon anymore, half the Napoleon. I did cut out most of my Italian specialties like provolone cheese, for example, and a few other. I did that at the beginning of the pandemic. I've not had a slice of provolone cheese since the pandemic began, and some other Italian specialties and favorites too. You know what? They put weight on you. I found that out, and this has worked. So I try not to eat the same thing 2 days in a row. I eat mostly soups, vegetables, a good amount of fish, little chicken for some protein. I hardly, Southern Italians don't eat much beef. I'm glad about that. So very rare do I have a burger. I think I'm having a burger today, or at least half a burger, but a Mediterranean style burger. I have it in the house already. I got it a couple of days ago. I'm going to try just to cut it in half. I may not, but it's a feta burger with onions and lettuce and tomatoes and coleslaw on top of it. So the real focus is not the burger so much, not the bun, but that other stuff that's in there too. and I have some apple juice every day. I think it gives me dietary fiber that I'm looking for. The apple juice I drink every day, and I kind of stick to that kind of a diet. Once in a while, if I'm out somewhere, I'll have a chicken parmesan on top of a bed of spaghetti. Once in a while, not too often, and it depends on what my stomach looks and feels like. I hate to put it that way, but that's what you have to do. So I know by the way I feel that I am what people say. I've had a few people say recently that, you went from overweight during the pandemic to a bit too thin. Now you look to be settled in at just about the right weight. So my right weight, according to what I've been told medically, is based on my 5'7" larger build kind of a frame, 168 to 172 pounds. Right now I'm in that 162, 163 range. That's where I like to stay. Gives me a little leeway in case I get hungry to have maybe a few extra potato chips one night, which I do once in a while at night. I'll have a few chips sometimes at night. And I'm a diet Coke or a diet Pepsi guy, caffeine free, no caffeine in it. And that's just been my favorite for a long time, and that seems to work for me. Probably 2 or 3 cups of coffee every day also too in there. I think the coffee helps, and it's helped me, no question about that. So I'm on a very restricted diet, and if I happen to be somewhere out socially for a drink or whatever with somebody sometime, and they'll say, "Oh, we're gonna eat something too, aren't we?" And you may, I'm not.
I'm right there with you though, man. Right when everything was happening, I went into the pandemic and I was like probably about 230, close to it.
Uh-huh. And what are you now?
I'm 180. That was
So you took off 50 pounds.
Yeah, that was my goal. I was getting to
Yeah,
180.
and I did 54. You did 50, I did 54. I know a couple of other people who have done what we did, and yet I know those who say, "Oh, I got in the habit of doing this and doing that." They may be 30, 40 pounds heavier than what they were, and you got to try to encourage them, and I do that. Maybe this is not the best way to go. I found that out.
Well, for me, I didn't really do nothing crazy. The only thing that I did differently was I just started taking walks.
Uh-huh.
And with that,
Yeah, I do. I don't do as much of that as I should. I've been encouraged to, but because of my work schedule, it's difficult to do. Or I may say, yes, what a nice morning, time for a walk. I got an interview in half an hour, so unless I'm walking doing the interview, I don't think that's going to work, So and then you gotta edit stuff. Then you gotta send it over to Mike in production. Then you gotta get it up on Facebook and tag, 30 people and make sure you tag the right. And then, you got a game to go to after that. And, you got a total traffic shift to work all night, writing and producing too. And when you get done with that 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, you can go to sleep for 3 hours and go. Then you got to be on the air at Big Hits 98.1 on Long Island. You got to be there like by 11:30. So walking doesn't really fit in there with a schedule like that.
Well, you think about it, you are walking during all that time.
Yeah, I know. Like people have said, well, at least you're hustling around.
Yeah,
which is
getting
good.
around.
Yeah, there's no question about that. And yet, it's not really the same as say I'm going to walk 3 miles today. Before the pandemic, I would do that on a regular basis. Go park my car 61st and 5th Avenue in Manhattan for years in front of the old Barney's, which doesn't exist anymore. I would park right there because I knew I could park there 7 o'clock at night. And that was a good way station for the kind of walk I would want to take. The area I knew no matter where I walked, that was my central location. I could always come back there. So I would do a 3 or 4 mile walk several nights per week. The funny thing is, it helped keep me in shape. I thought I was in pretty good shape in the 190s and low 200s. Anyway, actually, I could still move, even at the age of 66. I can still move on a basketball court. So a few years back before the pandemic, I could still do that. And yet, I knocked out the walking and started to do this. And like I said, what is considered the fad and what should work for everybody doesn't work for everybody. So I've done much less walking since the pandemic hit than I did before, and yet I was able to lose all this weight.
Keep it up, man.
I'm trying. That's all I can say. I'm trying.
Like a lot of people are probably sitting there looking at you like, no way, he's 66. You don't look.
Yeah, I get that all the time. Yep, I get that. I do, like I did that one time a few years back. I said, Dwight Eisenhower, you know who he was, right? Was the president. I was born. If you don't, and got to a point with somebody, I said, okay, you don't believe me? I hate to do this, but I'm going to pull out my driver's license and show you. And it says born 1956. I said, yeah, really? Yeah. There you go. And this was right before the pandemic too. I remember, told my father a little while ago, it was 94. I remember when you took me to 116th Street, Lexington Avenue, outside the subway in late summer, early fall kind of a day, warm day. And remember we had shirt sleeves on or whatever. And JFK, who was campaigning 2 months away from being elected, was making a speech on the corner of 116th and Lexington Avenue on the southeast corner. Let me think about that for a second. Yep, on the southwest corner of 116th Street and Lexington Avenue on this late afternoon in 1960, 2 months before the election. My father, I was, I guess, 3 years old at that time. Yeah, I was still 3 years old. Put me up on his shoulders, and I watched JFK's speech.
Wow.
From right, a diagonal corner away. I was a diagonal corner away, maybe 50 feet from JFK. A few years later in grammar school, 1964, I guess, Pope Paul VI came to New York City. And with my class, we were on 106th Street and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan and East Harlem. As he went by in the motorcade, we all had to chant out, Viva el Papa, Viva el Papa, long live the Pope.
All right, John, as we wrap this thing up, I just simply want to say thank you for coming on. It's truly been a privilege and an honor just to hear all your experience and your story.
Same here. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, it's like I said, it's gone by fast. No question about that. Like these couple of hour and a half we spent together here too, or so, that's gone by pretty fast too.
Yeah, it doesn't even feel like it's been a whole hour.
Yeah.
But this is also for anybody that's watching, listening right now. Just like John did today, you can come on here. It's an open platform for everybody. And you can come on and talk about your life experience, your story, where it all began. Talk about your testimony, anything. Just connect to me and let's make it happen. Other than that, this is Chris, your host. It's John Marino, not Dan Marino, John Marino.
John Marino, no relation to Dan.
We're signing off. Peace out.